We're focusing on the long-term causes of the Chinese Civil War and arguing how a combination of long-term issues can be considered the main cause of the Chinese Civil War because they created an environment conducive to power struggle.
One long-term cause that led to the Chinese Civil War is the spheres of influence in China. I'm going to focus on the United States' influence and the Soviets' influence. The United States wanted influence in China for a multitude of reasons, including resources like tea, porcelain, and silk, since at least the 17th century. The open door policy with China that the U.S. established in 1899 strengthened China's trade system and the big cities on the coast, like Shanghai and Tianjin. These cities turned into bustling centers of trade, industry, and technology. The people of these booming cities were enlightened, and ideologies of revolution and resistance formed within them. Furthermore, the United States' foreign influence in China can always be traced back to either commerce or the U.S.'s long-term goal of containment. The United States attempted to prevent a civil war happening in China immediately following the end of the Second World War. They tried mediating between the CCP and the GMD and hoped to create a coalition government. That failed due to the fact that fighting kept flaring up in Manchuria. So President Truman sent General George Marshall, the war hero in the war against Germany and Japan in the Pacific, to China to try to negotiate a peace agreement and to figure out the intentions of the Soviet Union in Manchuria. So here you can see the connection to the long-term goal of containment and them keeping an eye on the Soviet Union in Manchuria. Now, moving on to Soviet influence and their sphere of influence in China. The Soviets undoubtedly influenced the Chinese Civil War because communist ideology impacted CCP ideology. CCP leadership policy came from Ren Bishi in 1940, and he emphasized that they must focus more on Marxism-Leninism principles, while also praising Mao's leadership. While we know that Mao communism and Stalin communism are quite different, the communist principles, in some regard, are similar. And the CCP was founded in 1921 by Comintern intellectuals. Comintern ideology was a long-term cause of the Chinese Civil War. Since Comintern was organized mainly by Lenin, and Comintern principles were integrated into early CCP policy, the Soviet Union influenced China and attributed to one of the warring sides of the Chinese Civil War.
Hi, my name is Gabby, and I'll be covering the Opium Wars from 1839 to 1860. The surface-level cause of these wars was the unregulated and illegal import of opium, which is an addictive drug, by Britain into China. However, the opium imports were just the tipping point in a long-standing tension over foreign trading policy differences between Britain and China. In this way, the Opium Wars were representative of a larger political issue that arose from the difference in cultures in Britain and China. For example, the Chinese believed that they were the best, and that people who wanted to be a part of that would automatically come to them, so China was fairly isolated. Britain, who was a part of Western culture, believed exactly the opposite, that they had a duty to spread their culture and a right to trade with everyone. Clearly, these ideals on foreign trading policy clashed, and Britain did attempt civil negotiations to reconcile these differences. However, the Chinese mistook the British trips as simply paying their respects to the great Chinese society. Therefore, British decided to use the use of force in order to communicate that they wanted to have this policy changed, and this is what ended up being known as the military event of the Opium Wars. This contributed to the Chinese Civil War because it exposed the disjointed social life within China. China was not really a cohesive country, they were just a bunch of scattered villages and empires, and this was reflected in their lack of ability to pull together a real army to fend off the British, letting the British win and obviously the Chinese losing. This is also representative of a larger theme of national instability that would lead to the creation of the conflicting CCP and GMD parties. This is clear proof of our overall thesis that the long-term causes were the primary causes of the Chinese Civil War, as this groundwork for an unstable foundation was already being built way back in the 1800s. I'd also like to mention that this event belongs to the Social School of Historiography because of the large role that peasants and the other parts of social life in Chinese history played in the outcome of the Opium Wars as well as the formation of the Chinese Civil War.
I'm Sreya, and I will be talking about the First Sino-Japanese War, which was fought between Japan and China from August 1st, 1894 to September 17th, 1895. This was a military and political event with a structuralist historiographic background that had a huge influence on the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War, because it was a major turning point for the stability of China. The war destroyed China's unreachable superiority and forced the Chinese to reassess their place in the world. Also, the fact that they were defeated by Japan, a member of the Confucian world, rather than a Western power was significant. Victory by a former Confucian member meant that the power of the Confucian order was weakened. This meant a period of political instability for China. Also, the period after the war was known as the Scramble for Concessions, because European nations rushed to claim parts of China. As a result, Chinese sovereignty was destroyed and the stability of the country collapsed. One thing led to another, and the country was soon thrown into civil war. If it wasn't for the influence of foreign powers and the political weakness that followed after the First Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Civil War may have been prevented.
Both men had experience in China, Weidmeier as an advisor to Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek and Stuart as a career missionary. The choice of Stuart over Weidmeier was not meant to symbolize a shift in U.S. policy, but was tacit recognition that the missionary presence in China was a large asset in a chaotic situation. Prior to World War II, the American presence in China was largely made up of missionaries. The United States government had a very small presence on the ground in China, so missionaries like Stuart were largely better informed on the day-to-day life of the Chinese people, as well as the political climate of the country. While their history had been a very rocky road from early restrictions on their movement to repeated uprising against their influence, the challenge of the Chinese communists was something entirely different. Even so, most missionaries did not realize it immediately. Prior disturbances, even including the Japanese invasion, had been restricted in the geographic scope and were limited in duration. The dissertation has discovered that there was a forgotten voice among liberal Protestant American missionaries in China. Those missionaries went against what would seem conventional wisdom by seeking accommodation with the atheist Chinese communists during and immediately after the Chinese Civil War. Protestant missionaries and their motivations, backgrounds, and religious beliefs varied widely. Some had a more liberal view of Christianity, which believed that putting Christ's work into action in the world was their primary duty. Each missionary was shaped by the churches or mission organizations that sponsored them, but also carry their own individual beliefs with them. These Protestant missionaries were helping the cause of the Chinese Civil War because they were primarily causing the conflicts that led up to the start of the Chinese Civil War. The Americans also caused some of the tensions because of the differing in ideology of the two sides. Since Americans did not have a healthy relationship with the Chinese in this time period, the large amount of American missionaries were not something that did not go unnoticed.
This is Navina, and I will be talking about the fall of the Qing dynasty, which in respect to PEMS most suitably falls under political history since the imperial rule of the dynasty and the tensions that caused it to be overthrown allowed for the formation of those two political groups that led to the Chinese Civil War as they fought for power. The Qing dynasty ruled from 1644 to 1911, and it was the last imperial dynasty in China's history of over 4,000 years of imperial rule. External factors such as the Opium Wars, Sino-Japanese War, and Russian-Japanese War allowed Western and Japanese control of the country, thus weakening the Qing Empire politically in terms of power, but also economically, as they were forced into trade agreements that gave up their resources and territories to foreign influence. Internally, China was far underdeveloped compared to neighboring countries, was overpopulated causing famines, and the empire was overall lacking political control, leading to a country that was not at all unified. Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the Revolutionary Alliance, wanted to replace the Qing rule with his principles of nationalism, democracy, socialism, finally succeeding in 1911 when the Qing dynasty fell and the Republic of China was formed, in 1912. The tensions and issues that led to the revolution that overthrew the Qing, like the anti-foreign sentiment, weakness of the government, and imperialism, will be seen again 15 years later during the Civil War. The fall of the Qing is one of the major causes for the Civil War, as it acted as the foundation that allowed the events following 1911 and that eventually built up to the Civil War to occur. If the Qing did not lose power, imperial rule would continue in China, and the chain of short-term events leading to the Civil War would have never happened. Thus, the long-term causes are the main contributors to the Chinese Civil War, as they formed the cracked foundation that allowed the other events leading to the war to occur.
It's Tanvi, and I'll be talking about Yuan Shikai. After Dowager Cixi died in 1908, she was replaced by the Puyi, who we previously discussed. At this point, the Qing dynasty faced increasing economic pressures and increasing demands for reforms, and it collapsed. This led to a period of civil unrest within China. This period was only overcome when two leading members of the anti-Qing movement, Yuan Shikai and Sun Yat-sen, made a compromise. Before we get into the compromise, let's discuss some of the background information. Yuan Shikai was a Chinese general and politician. He was famous for his influence during the late Qing dynasty because he had helped the Western forces end the Boxer Rebellion. He was the first president of the Republic of China and ruled from 1912 to 1915. As for Sun Yat-sen, he formed a party called Kuomintang in 1912 and declared it a parliamentary party. Sun Yat-sen agreed to Yuan Shikai's rule in order to avert the possibility of China descending into civil war. However, he tried to undermine Yuan's power by moving him from his power base in Beijing to the south in Nanjing to set up a new government. Yuan refused to leave, and so a second revolution failed, and Sun fled to Japan in 1913. However, Yuan started to damage his own reputation by abolishing regional assemblies and trying to centralize power. This led to tax revenues being centrally controlled, which in turn further alienated all of the provincial powers. What finally brought Yuan down was his self-proclamation as emperor in 1916. By doing this, he lost the support of the military and was forced to step down. He died just 3 months later from kidney failure. The China left behind by Yuan, along with the uprisings from Sun Yat-sen's followers, directly caused the 12 years of warfare between the warlord generals of China's provinces and the weak Republic of China. Furthermore, Sun's death in 1925 all but set the stage for conflict between the Communist Party and the Nationalists. Clearly, because of the actions taken by Yuan Shikai, the power struggle that ensued was only to be expected. From a historiographic viewpoint, this information was conveyed through great man theory, where personal charisma, intelligence, wisdom, or political skill utilizes an individual's power in a way that has a decisive historical impact. The issues that China had been facing since the beginning set up circumstances for the Civil War to take place, and thus it can be argued that long-term issues were the primary cause for the Chinese Civil War.
I'm Travis King. The Kuomintang are also known as the Kuomintang, the GMD, and the Chinese Nationalist Party. The party began in 1894 out of a movement for revolutionary thinking, intending to bring down the ruling dynasty. They hated the dynasty, the warlords, and the feudal system as a whole, and longed for a new government. It is China's oldest political party. During World War II, they were based on the island of Taiwan and allied with the United States. Their agenda was to use the United States' power to cripple the Chinese Communist Party that was in power for the duration of the war. Upon this plan failing and the war coming to an end, with the Communist Party still in power, the GMD decided to take power for themselves. They began a civil war. Although, to say they began is slightly wrong. They were actually just continuing a conflict which had been ongoing for many years now, but was put on hold by the war with Japan during World War II. This is social history, since it deals with an issue of political parties and government systems in a country that affect history as a whole. The GMD was half the reason for the Civil War beginning, the other half being the Communist Party. Without the GMD, there would have been no war. As a result, the GMD was a long-term cause of the Chinese Civil War, since the war was a direct result of the GMD's existence.
The last emperor of China's Qing dynasty was Henry Puyi, and became emperor at the young age of 3. Since becoming an emperor as a toddler, many leaders stepped in his place of power until 1931, when he came into power, during which the Japanese took control over Manchuria. Thus he was considered to be the puppet emperor of Manchukuo, which was formerly Manchuria. He was considered a puppet because he basically did whatever the Japanese told him to do, regardless of his own opinions. Many of the Chinese people felt as though he betrayed China because of his support for the Japanese, and at the end of the war, he was captured by the Chinese and held as a war criminal and was imprisoned for many years, until he was sent to work as a gardener under Mao Zedong's rule. All of this had an economic long-term effect because when the Japanese took over Manchuria, otherwise known as Manchukuo at the time, and Puyi was emperor, the land had many resources, allowing the Japanese to have that advantage of those resources, which eventually led to the Japanese weakening the Republic of China's forces. This weakening eventually led to China's forces to retreat from the mainland of China, thus showing that it had a long-term effect because it started out as Puyi becoming the emperor of this new land that the Japanese took control of, and then all that eventually led to the Japanese weakening the Republic of China, which basically helped lead to the Republic of China's downfall.
The National Protection War, also known as the Anti-Monarchy War and the Constitutional Protection War, lasted 3 years, from 1915 to 1918. This was the start of many complications between the North and South China. The reason this war broke out was because the new ruling of China. Emperor Yuan Shikai took his place in 1915, and during this time, several military leaders were aiming to gain their independence. They had to do this by placing several different launches against Yuan, marking the start of the war. Throughout the war, Yuan faced several defeats, eventually leading to the success of the South. This can be considered 3 different types of history: political, military, and social history, with a liberal historiographic background. It is political history because the new emperor of China was the main reason for the outbreak of the Civil War, and he created many political problems throughout the war. It is considered military history because South China's troops were able to defeat the Emperor Ran troops, also known as the North, and it is considered social history because the southern leaders were able to declare their independence successfully at the end of the war outbreak. This fight for independence led to Yuan being defeated and stepping down from his role as emperor. However, this only worsened the tension between the two parties, eventually leading to the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War.
I'm Lexi Ritchie, and I'm going to talk about the Wuchang Uprising. So the ruling Qing dynasty created the new army in the year 1900. The center of weapons and materials manufacture for this new army was Wuchang, the Chinese city with the most modern military industry. The Kuomintang, under Sun Yat-sen, was created in the early 20th century with the primary goal of modernizing China by bringing down the ruling Qing dynasty. His revolutionary ideas influenced members of the new army in Wuchang, leading many of them to join revolutionary organizations. Many of the Chinese people believed that the Qing dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven, which fostered opposition and revolutionary ideals. A coup had been planned. However, the Wuchang uprising began by accident when revolutionaries accidentally set off a bomb, leading to a governmental investigation in which a list of names of revolutionaries was found. In a panic, they staged a successful coup. The Wuchang uprising in central China on October 10, 1911, led to the overthrow of imperial rule in China, known as the Xinhai Revolution, the end of the dynasties that had ruled China for more than 2,000 years, inevitably causing political disorder in China. After the Qing dynasty fell, Yuan Shikai came to power, but his government was weak and unorganized, so by the time he died in 1916, China was extremely bankrupt. The Wuchang uprising overthrew the government that had been ruling China for over 2,000 years, the Qing dynasty, thereby disrupting the nation's balance and stability. The leader who took over after the fall of the Qing dynasty, Yuan Shikai, left the nation's government in a state of weakness, allowing room for a power struggle between the GMD and the CCP. Because the Wuchang uprising led to the Xinhai Revolution, in which the political power in China shifted, the event was significant to China's political history. As the Qing dynasty was overthrown and a provisional government established, the government went from strong to weak, impacting China politically. The Wuchang uprising is also an element of China's social history because the citizens of China came together the revolutionary organizations in order to overthrow the government. The contributions of the masses were crucial in overthrowing the Qing dynasty. Much of the orthodox GMD historiography about the uprising in 1911 suggests that Sun Yat-sen was a huge part of the movement by focusing on his personality, while communist viewpoints suggest the opposite. However, both sides largely respect Sun Yat-sen. So to tie this all back to the argument that the Chinese Civil War can be attributed to multiple long-term issues that created an environment conducive to the power struggle, the Wuchang Uprising was one of the early events that caused the Chinese Civil War in the long term. Without the overthrow of the Qing dynasty, neither the GMD nor the CCP would have been able to gain nearly as much power as they did, so there couldn't have been a power struggle between them. The Wuchang Uprising created an environment conducive to this power struggle by knocking out a strong government and replacing it with a weak one, allowing for the formation of the foundation of the Chinese Civil War.
This is Devin Higgins. Empress Dowager Cixi became a concubine to the Chinese emperor in 1851. She soon gave birth to his heir, which led to her rise in power in the court. For over more than 40 years, Cixi had influence of the court with 3 different emperors, her imperial husband, their son, and her nephew. In the early 1900s, as she realized her health was failing, she began planning for the future emperor Puyi, who would be the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. She believed he could grow up to have the same ideals and interests as her, but when she died, the people were still not happy. They began rebelling against the monarchy because without Cixi, they figured out that it was not the best form of government for them, and that they needed something better. This, along with the fall of the Qing dynasty as a whole, quickly spread and eventually expanded into the Chinese Civil War.
Hi, this is Krishna here, and I'll be talking about another important part of the pre-Chinese Civil War, the Boxer Rebellion. The main focus of the Boxer Rebellion was to keep foreign influence away from China. Originally, the Boxers were kept more secretly and went against the Manchu Qing dynasty, but after the foreign elements of the Qing government won control in 1898, the Boxers were convinced to join the government in driving out the foreigners. This is why the Boxer Rebellion was more about the foreigners than it was about the government, and was overall a social issue that greatly involved economic, political, and military aspects. In some respects, a foretaste of the current war against terrorism, and that basically a grassroots organization fought what they saw as a holy war against a technologically superior collection of foreign powers to preserve their values and beliefs. 70% of these Boxers consisted of lower class or peasants in cities. Much of this event was historiographically social, as it was a rebellion that started from the lower class people of China and definitely took a bottom-up approach due to the social, economic, and political impact that the foreigners had on these lower class citizens. In the end, an international relief force defeated the Boxers. The foreign forces won simply because there were 20,000 of them. They also had overwhelming power, particularly firepower, and were brutal in the way that they used it. The Western propaganda, as pictured below on the right, portrayed the Boxers as thugs and savages. The legitimacy of the ruling Manchu was extremely compromised, and the weaknesses of China were further revealed. The Boxer Rebellion helped contribute to the fall of the Manchu, and thus the start of the Chinese Civil War. In the long term, we can now see that it was the beginning of the Chinese Revolution, and that the Chinese saw this as something that they would have to organize themselves to defend against.